There's a podcast I listen to regularly called Ukraine the Latest by The Telegraph out of London. And as it puts it, war in Ukraine is reshaping our world. Every weekday, The Telegraph's top journalists analyze the invasion from all angles: military, humanitarian, political, economic, historical, and tell you what you need to know to stay updated. And they use idioms in that podcast a fair bit, particularly the pinch of salt one. It seems like almost every episode they repeat some Russian claim and then warn listeners that it's from Russia, so it has to be taken with a grain of salt, or a pinch of salt, or a spoonful of salt, or a giant dose of salt, or a bucket of it, or a mountain. Meaning, of course, that the claim may be misleading or unverified and should be viewed with skepticism or not taken literally. But what I like to listen for, idiom-wise anyway, is some British version of a familiar American idiom. There's something jarring about hearing a familiar phrase with an unfamiliar word, and it seems to shine a light on the idiom, throwing some unnatural attention on it, making it stand out in a way that I'm not sure I find pleasing, but also not sure that I don't. So it was the other day when they used the idiom "throw a spanner in the works" that I thought I'd check that one out, and that's a variation on the American idiom to throw a wrench in the works. A spanner is a British word for wrench. And first off, I can't say I'm overly impressed with the word spanner to describe this tool. I'd expect a spanner to span, but it doesn't. It wrenches. Not to mention all the nice associations that fit in so nicely with wrench, but not spanner. Think heart-wrenching. Heart spanning just doesn't cut it. But back to the idiom, to throw a spanner or wrench in the works of something means, of course, to gum up the gears of something, to cause a disturbance, to damage or change something in a way that ruins it or prevents it from working properly. And this one has all kinds of variations. Throw a wrench in the works, the gears, the wheels, and you sometimes hear it used with Monkeywrench specifically. As an aside, the Monkeywrench, which is called an adjustable spanner in Britain, appears to have reminded somebody in the middle of the 19th century of a monkey's jaws. It does kind of loosely resemble the sliding jaws of this tool. And Monkeywrench specifically, it has something more of a connotation of sabotaging something, deliberately jamming up the works. There's a novel that I really like by Edward Abbey called The Monkeywrench Gang, which involves the use of sabotage to protest environmentally damaging activities in the Southwest. You had Seldom Seen Smith, a Jack Mormon river guide, along with Doc Sarvis, a wealthy surgeon, and Bonnie Abzug, his young Jewish feminist assistant, and the Green Beret Vietnam vet George Hayduke, who formed the gang. And they went around trying to destroy what they saw as a system that pollutes and destroys the American West. They attacked deserted bulldozers and trains and whatnot. Anyway, the novel was so impactful and influential that the term monkey wrench has come to mean, besides just the sabotage and damage to machines, any sabotage, activism, or law breaking to preserve wild spaces and ecosystems. But if you're going to read Abbey, his best book for my money is Desert Solitaire, which was based on his time as a park ranger at Arches National Park in Utah. That's a really beautiful book, iconic piece of nature writing. But while we're talking about jamming up the gears of something, I can't help but mention the famous and passionate speech of Mario Savio from 1964 in the context of supporting civil rights and protesting against the Vietnam War. And the speech is called, or has been come to be called, Bodies Upon the Gears. And he stood in front of Sprout Hall at Berkeley University in California and said as follows.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. So here...
All right. I remember the first time I saw this speech. It was in some documentary about 60s counterculture, and I was really moved by the passion and commitment there, and I still think about this speech from time to time. At any rate, wrench in the works seems like it might be something of a linguistic rarity, a commonly used English phrase that was coined in New Zealand. According to legend, it originated in Wangamamona, a township on New Zealand's North Island. And there's a plaque displayed there at the site of what claims to be the oldest oil well in the world, and it says the following. This is the site of the world's first oil well, drilled here in 1828. Legend has it that Mr. Ewan McGregor set up the derrick and drilled a hole 700 feet deep. All was going well, and signs of an oil strike were imminent when his son Jethro dropped a spanner down the hole. From this incident, the term "a spanner in the works" originated and is now known worldwide. The spanner was not retrievable, and so another hole was drilled, this time 1,200 feet, where gas was struck. Alas, Ewan's other son, Cletus, fell into the hole and ended all prospecting on the site. Early uses of spanner in the works pop up in print in New Zealand as well, so this does seem like a plausible origin story. One I enjoyed hearing about anyway, so I thought it might be worth looking at this and other tool-related idioms in this episode. So welcome to Idiom America, the podcast that explores this kind of stuff. Probably the most common tool, or at least the first one that comes to my mind, is a hammer. And there are all sorts of famous hammers. Maxwell's silver hammer, John Henry's hammer, Maslow's hammer, Thor's hammer, called Mjolnir, by the way. But let's take a look at Maslow's hammer. And this is also known as the law of the hammer, or law of the instrument, or a golden hammer. And it's a cognitive bias that involves an over-reliance on a familiar tool. As the American psychologist Abraham Maslow put it in 1966, if the only tool you have is a hammer, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail. And this line may not be original to him, but he certainly popularized it, although the internet sometimes misattributes this one to Mark Twain in the punchier form. If all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. Think about a country having a strong military as the hammer. It's bound to view some geopolitical problem as a nail its military compound. But there's a corollary here too. When you don't have a hammer, you don't want anything to look like a nail. And you can think here of some country that doesn't have the hammer of a strong military, maybe sticking its head in the sand a bit and doing everything it can to pretend that the era of war is over. Speaking of hammers and nails, there's that wonderfully figurative idiom, hit the nail on the head, which itself hits the nail on the head by doing or saying something exactly right, or getting to the precise point. And this one's extremely old, hard to say how old, probably as long as people have been pounding nails into wood with hammers, which people have been doing since at least biblical times. Think of the crucifixion of Christ. But hammers aren't just used by carpenters or framers or roofers to drive nails into wood. Blacksmiths make good use of them too, although perhaps not as much these days as they once did. Think of that idiom we looked at in the episode about bladed tools, to beat one's sword into a plowshare. And that bronze statue in the Ewan Garden in New York of a Soviet-looking guy doing just that with a big hammer and sickle-looking hammer. But from blacksmiths, we get idioms like between the hammer and the anvil, a more primitive version of which might be between a rock and a hard place. One presumes that the hard place is probably another rock, by the way. If you're using a rock for a hammer, you probably don't have an anvil either. But both idioms mean having to choose between two difficult or distasteful options, a predicament or a quandary. Between the hammer and the anvil is more often heard in the UK, whereas caught between a rock and a hard place, or stuck between a rock and a hard place, originated in America in the early 1900s to describe a dispute between copper miners and the mining companies in Bisbee, Arizona. The miners demanded better working conditions, which the companies refused to supply, and that left the miners with two unpleasant choices: continue to mine in the same terrible conditions, that's the rock, or face unemployment and poverty, a hard place. And this phrase got pretty popular during the Great Depression of the 1930s, as it described the way a lot of people felt, I suppose. And another one from blacksmithing is to go at it hammer and tongs. If you're going at something hammer and tongs, you're doing it with tremendous fervor, determination, energy, forcefulness. just like a blacksmith would use his hammer and tongs with great vim and vigor, showering lusty blows while the metal's red hot, or, as the idiom would have it, striking while the iron is hot. And this one is especially used to refer to arguing. If two people are going at it hammer and tongs, they're fighting like cats and dogs, arguing with a lot of energy and violence. What started as a minor disagreement has escalated into a heated argument, and the two have been going at it hammer and tongs ever since. A final one from the blacksmithing context would be to hammer something out, like an agreement or plan, meaning to exhaustively discuss or argue over something until it takes the desired shape. Or take a different hammer, John Henry's hammer that he died with in his hand, the sledgehammer, the one he used to drive home railroad spikes in a race with the steam drill, which is the subject of some really great songs like Bruce Springsteen's John Henry and We Shall Overcome the Seeger Sessions, or the Jerry Garcia acoustic band Spike Driver Blues. And we get a couple more idioms here. First, there's a sledgehammer argument, which means an overwhelming argument, one that eliminates all opposition. Then there's using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, which means to use excessive or overcomplicated or extravagant means or force to accomplish something relatively minor or simple. To kill a fly with a cannonball, to use a sword instead of a scalpel. And a sledgehammer might also be the hammer referred to in the idiom to bring the hammer down or to drop the hammer on. But there are some other contenders here. If you're bringing the hammer down on somebody or dropping it on them, you're strongly rebuking or punishing them. Federal regulators indicated they were ready to drop the hammer on loan sharks who were exploiting loopholes in existing financial law. Bringing a sledgehammer down on somebody would certainly qualify as harsh punishment, but there are other possibilities here without any clear pinpointable origin. It could refer to a judge banging his gavel, dropping the hammer for some harsh punishment to come, or it could refer to the same action by an auctioneer at a slave auction. Or it could refer to the hammer of a gun and the punishment to come if you bring the hammer down there. Speaking of the auction, I should probably at least mention the idiom go under the hammer, which means, of course, to be put up for sale at auction. Finally, on hammers, you can put the hammer down, step on the gas and speed up, put the pedal to the metal. Or you can hammer something into somebody's head or skull. Or if you pick up another tool, you can drill it into their head. Or you can go out after work and hammer some beers together and get absolutely hammered. And then you may have heard the expression dumb as a bag of hammers or ugly as a bag of hammers. I like the rhyming dumber than a box of rocks better myself. But there is something about calling somebody dumb by not only comparing them to an inanimate object or a whole bag of inanimate objects, but to tools in particular that gives the insult a little extra zing. And that's probably related to this alternative definition of tool as an insult to refer to somebody who's used or manipulated by another, a tool of management, somebody who's too dumb to know he's being used, people who can't think for themselves, somebody who lacks personal convictions and generally just goes along with what they believe is expected of them without bothering to question the higher purpose. Somebody who's perhaps not the sharpest tool in the shed, if you will, not the sharpest knife in the drawer or crayon in the box or the brightest bulb in the chandelier. You probably heard that it's a poor worksman or craftsman or carpenter who blames his tools, just like it's a poor musician who blames his instrument. This one's been around for a really long time, with the oldest version seeming to come from the French, with a little twist. A bad workman will never find a good tool. Finally, it's worth mentioning tools of the trade. Those skills, tools, training, and knowledge that a person needs to complete a specific task successfully. And the tools of the trade for this podcast, of course, and for a lot of things really, are words. Idioms in particular. And there are some more tool ones to come, I promise. But I've probably tooled around with these ones long enough. Thanks for listening.